She pressed her ear against the transistor radio hidden under her pillow, the tinny sound of a pop song drifting through the darkness of a shared bedroom. Outside, the neighborhood was perfectly quiet. The lawns were trimmed, the curtains were drawn. Everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to look, and that, more than anything, was the whole point. In 1963, appearance wasn't just important. It was survival. We think we understand the early 1960s. We've seen the movies. The pastel kitchens, the gleaming cars, the girls in full skirts spinning under gymnasium lights. It looks innocent. It looks simple. And parts of it genuinely were. But for a 16-year-old girl navigating the world in 1963, the picture was far more complicated, far more pressured, and far more quietly heartbreaking than any of those images led on. This is not the version you've seen before. This is what it actually felt like to be young, female, and alive in America in 1963. The alarm didn't go off. There was no alarm. She woke up at 6 in the morning because the bedroom was cold. Central heating in a typical suburban tract home was unreliable at best. And because the sound of her father getting ready down the hall had always been the household clock. She shared this bedroom with a younger sister. The room was small. There was no space for privacy, no space for silence, no space that belonged entirely to her. And then the work began. Not schoolwork, not chores. The work of becoming presentable. In 1963, a teenage girl's morning routine was an engineering project. She had slept the entire night with her hair wrapped around hard plastic rollers, or, on particularly determined evenings, around empty frozen orange juice cans, the metal edges biting into her scalp all night. She unwound them carefully, then spent the next 20 minutes back-combing her hair section by section with a fine-tooth comb, teasing it upward and outward into the requisite height and volume. Then came the Aquanet, a long, hissing cloud of aerosol hairspray that lacquered the whole structure into something that could survive a windstorm. Her hair wasn't hair by the time she was done. It was architecture. You didn't run your fingers through it. If you did, your hand would get stuck. Then came the rest of it. A nylon slip, a structured brassiere, a girdle. Yes, even at 16, even if she was perfectly slim, because the silhouette had to be smooth and rigid and controlled. Metal garter clips dangled from the girdle's hem to hold up individual nylon stockings, which ran constantly and cost a fortune to replace. Over all of this, a pressed wool pleated skirt hitting below the knee, a freshly ironed blouse, a cardigan, white bobby socks, and leather loafers with a penny tucked into each toe. No jeans, no sweatpants, no exceptions. The school had a dress code, and girls who arrived in trousers were sent home immediately, regardless of how cold the morning was. This was the costume. And like all costumes, it communicated something very specific. I am appropriate. I am controlled. I am not a problem. Breakfast was a quick, communal affair. Frozen orange juice reconstituted from a concentrate can, Kellogg's Corn Flakes, white toast with margarine. Her mother was already in a house dress, making her father's lunch for the day. The radio played top 40 hits in the background. Maybe Bobby Vinton, maybe the Chiffons, maybe a Beach Boys song that made the whole room feel briefly, sweetly optimistic. She didn't own a car. Almost no teenager did, and for girls especially, the world was defined by how far you could walk. She carried her textbooks to school, cradled against her chest, arms wrapped around the stack like a shield. Watch old footage of a 1963 high school hallway, and you'll notice something that takes a moment to register. No backpacks. Not a single one. Backpacks were for soldiers and hikers. High school girls carried their books pressed to their bodies, spines curved, shoulders forward. It's a posture that looks, in retrospect, almost protective. The high school itself was its own carefully managed world. The hallways smelled of floor wax and chalk dust and the faint chemical tang of someone's hairspray. The lockers were olive green or beige metal, and the social architecture inside those walls was just as rigid as anything outside them. Here is something that tends to surprise modern audiences. The curriculum she sat down to every morning was not the same curriculum the boy in the next classroom received. While her male classmates were routed into shop class, advanced chemistry and mathematics, she was guided, firmly, systematically, without much room for argument, into home economics and secretarial skills. Home economics meant learning to bake a proper soufflé, sew a straight seam, and set a dinner table with the plate placed exactly the correct number of inches from the edge. Secretarial skills meant Greg's shorthand and hours of practice on a manual typewriter, the keys stiff enough to leave impressions on your fingertips. This wasn't cruelty. The teachers genuinely believed they were preparing her for her future. And her future, as everyone around her understood it, was a home of her own and a husband at the head of the table. Academic ambition in a girl was not celebrated in 1963. It was viewed by many with quiet concern. A girl who was too smart, too driven, too obviously capable, she might intimidate potential suitors. And that was a problem no parent wanted to create. The social world of a 1963 high school was governed by rules so precise and so thoroughly enforced that they required no written documentation. Everyone simply knew a girl's social value was fragile and public. The worst thing that could happen, socially, professionally, existentially, was a damaged reputation. And reputation was managed not through anything she did publicly, but through whisper networks, bathroom graffiti, and the brutal efficiency of teenage gossip. A girl who went too far with a boy, or was merely suspected of it, could find herself suddenly, completely alone. No confrontation, no explanation, just the cold silence of a lunch table that was mysteriously full when she arrived. At the same time, she was expected to be desirable, to attract male attention, to be noticed, but not too much, to be warm, but not forward. The magazines she read, and she read them voraciously, 17 most of all at 50 cents a copy, spelled it out in language that was blunt to the point of breathtaking. Articles advised her to hide her intelligence in conversation, to let the boy win at games, to smile and nod and be an excellent listener, to be, in other words, a carefully curated performance of pleasantness. The communication tools available to navigate all of this were almost comically limited. The telephone, a black or pastel pink rotary dial Western Electric set, bolted to the wall of the kitchen or hallway, was the center of her social universe. She stretched its coiled cord as far as it would physically go, around door frames and into closets, trying to carve out some fragment of privacy. She had roughly 15 minutes before her father would appear and tell her to clear the line. Long-distance calls were strictly forbidden. The per-minute rates were high enough that a single unauthorized call to a friend 2 towns away could trigger a genuine household argument. There was no voicemail, no caller ID, no call waiting. If the line was busy when someone called, they received a harsh, repetitive beep and had to try again later. And there was one more complication. In many suburban and rural neighborhoods, telephone lines were shared. It was called a party line. If she picked up the receiver to call her best friend, she might hear her elderly neighbor mid-conversation on the same wire. She'd have to hang up and wait, and wonder whether, on some previous call, that same neighbor had been quietly listening to her. The other method of communication was the folded note. A piece of binder paper, written in careful cursive, folded into an intricate triangle small enough to palm, passed hand to hand through the hallway. If a teacher intercepted one, and teachers watched for exactly this, it was read aloud to the entire class. The humiliation was the point. It was a lesson in the cost of privacy. After school, the afternoon opened up in a way the morning never quite did. She walked downtown with friends to the 5 and dime store, an F.W. Woolworth or an S.S. Kreisky, the kind of place that sold everything from hairpins to goldfish under one fluorescent-lit roof. The soda fountain at the back had chrome stools with red vinyl tops and a stainless steel milkshake mixer that hummed at a pitch she associated entirely with happiness. They shared a cherry Coke. They split a basket of French fries. They flipped through the vinyl record bin, pulling out 45 RPM singles by the Ronettes or the Shirelles, squinting at the small print on the colorful Capitol or Motown labels. This was pleasure, real, uncomplicated pleasure. And it's worth pausing here to say clearly, it was not all hardship. There was genuine sweetness in this world. The smallness of it created an intimacy that's genuinely difficult to replicate today. You knew your neighbors. You knew the woman behind the drugstore counter. You walked the same 3 blocks every afternoon with the same friends, and those friendships deepened in the unhurried way that only repetition allows. But even here, at the soda fountain, with a cold drink and a good song playing on the radio above the counter, the pressures were never far away. If she was watching her weight, and the magazines had been very clear that she should be watching her weight, she might skip the milkshake and reach instead for a Tab, a brand new diet soda that had just appeared on shelves in 1963. Tab tasted strongly of chemicals, sweetened with saccharin and cyclamate, and it was marketed to teenage girls with advertising that was nakedly transactional. Stay thin, and boys will like you. She might also know girls at school who were drinking Metrocol, a chalky, thick powder shake designed as a meal replacement. Both of these products told the same story. Your body is a project, and the project is for someone else's benefit. The weight charts in 17 magazine were precise. They told you exactly what you should weigh at your exact height. If you were even slightly over, the implication was clear. The solution was clear. And the psychological damage of that message, delivered monthly to girls who were still growing, was not something anyone was measuring at the time. Imagine it's a Friday afternoon in early autumn 1963. You rush home from school at 3:15 because American Bandstand starts at 3:30, and missing it is simply not an option. You throw your books on the kitchen table, pull up close to the television set, a large, heavy console in the living room, the furniture equivalent of a small car, and watch Dick Clark introduce the Philadelphia teenagers who dance on screen every single afternoon. You copy the moves, the twist, the mashed potato, the locomotion. You practice in the living room in your school clothes with the sound turned up until your mother tells you to turn it down. The music in 1963 was extraordinary, even if you couldn't quite articulate why. The girl groups especially, the Ronettes, the Crystals, the Chiffons, sang about longing and loyalty and heartbreak with a directness that felt like someone finally saying out loud what you'd been thinking. He's so fine. Be my baby. It's my party. These songs were small and perfect, and they understood you. What none of you knew, sitting in those living rooms, was that the biggest musical moment in human history was about 11 weeks away. The Beatles would land in America in February 1964. In the autumn of 1963, they were entirely unknown on American shores. The teenagers of 1963 were standing at the absolute edge of a cultural explosion they couldn't yet see or hear. They were primed for it, emotionally, culturally, hormonally ready, without knowing anything was coming. That quality of 1963, of standing at a threshold without knowing it, runs through everything about the year. Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique in February of 1963. It argued, in language that felt radical at the time, that the domestic life being sold to American women as the pinnacle of fulfillment was, for many of them, quietly suffocating. It became a bestseller. It was passed between women in living rooms and church halls and faculty lounges. Some of them recognized themselves in every sentence. Others found it threatening, even offensive. A 16-year-old girl in 1963 probably hadn't read it, but she may have seen it sitting on a kitchen counter. She may have heard her mother discussing it in a lowered voice with a neighbor, and somewhere beneath the surface of her daily routine, the girdle, the shorthand class, the waiting by the phone, she may have felt the precise thing Friedan was describing without yet having the language for it. That was the particular cruelty and complexity of 1963. The questions were beginning. The answers had not arrived yet. Evening brought its own architecture of expectation. Dinner at 6 o'clock at the dining table, with the whole family present. Her father at the head, the news on the radio or the small kitchen TV, conversation directed by him about topics he chose. Teenagers didn't speak freely at the dinner table unless invited to. After dinner, the dishes, washed by hand in the sink, dried with a tea towel, every last one of them. No dishwasher. There was no dishwasher in a standard 1963 suburban home. Then homework negotiated around the telephone and the television schedule. The family gathered in the living room at 8:30 to watch the Dick Van Dyke Show or the Beverly Hillbillies on one of the 3 available channels, CBS, NBC, ABC, and nothing else. If the reception went fuzzy, which it frequently did, she was sent to adjust the rabbit ear antennas on top of the set, turning them slowly left and right while her father called out whether the picture had improved or not. If she needed to write a school report, on ancient Egypt, say, or the American Revolution, she couldn't search anything. She opened the family's set of Encyclopedia Britannica, purchased from a door-to-door salesman for more money than the family had easily to spare, and worked from whatever was printed on those pages. If she needed something the encyclopedia didn't have, she walked to the public library, worked through the wooden card catalog cabinet drawer by drawer, found a Dewey Decimal number, located the book on the shelf, and copied what she needed onto index cards with a pen. The information available to her was finite. It had physical edges. By 10 o'clock, she was in her nightgown, resetting her hair in rollers for the following morning. And then, in the darkness of the shared bedroom, she pressed that small transistor radio under her pillow and listened. The transistor radio was the first truly personal technology in a teenager's life. The first object that belonged to her, that she controlled, that gave her something that wasn't mediated by her parents or her teachers or the schedule of the household. She could take it to the beach, to the park, to the backyard. She could hold it an inch from her ear in the dark and catch a distant AM station playing rock and roll at midnight, the signal fading in and out like something she was only almost hearing. Legendary disc jockeys like Cousin Brucey in New York or Dick Biondi in Chicago talked to her in rapid fire, knowing patter that felt conspiratorial, like they were in on the same secret, her and a million girls she'd never meet, all listening in the dark at the same time. That moment, radio under the pillow, the house quiet, the world outside perfectly still, was perhaps the closest thing to privacy she got all day. There are parts of this story that are genuinely hard to sit with. If a girl in 1963 became pregnant, the consequences were total and immediate. She was expelled from school. The standard language was that her presence would corrupt other students. She was removed from her life, from her friendships, from everything familiar, and sent to a home for unwed mothers, a discreet institution, often run by religious organizations, where she lived under a false name, gave birth in isolation, and surrendered her child for forced adoption. She returned months later, expected to resume her normal life as though nothing had happened. Every 1963 high school yearbook contains a few girls who disappear between junior and senior year. No goodbye, no transfer notice. The class knew, without speaking about it, exactly what the silence meant. Birth control was not a straightforward solution. The pill had been approved in 1960, but in 1963 it was illegal for unmarried women in dozens of states. Abortion was illegal everywhere in America. A desperate girl had essentially 2 options: disappear quietly or turn to underground networks. Unlicensed practitioners, coat hangers, toxic chemical douches that killed hundreds of young women every year from sepsis and hemorrhage. The word illegal doesn't begin to capture what that reality felt like from the inside. And there were other absences, other silences. There were no sexual harassment laws. A teacher, a boss, a neighbor could say or do things to a teenage girl that today would result in immediate legal consequences, and she had no recourse, no HR department, no legal framework to appeal to. It simply was not recognized as a category of harm. She could not open a bank account without her father's signature. She could not get a credit card. She could not sign a lease. Her money, the $15 or $20 a week she might earn babysitting or working behind a counter, often went directly to her mother to help cover groceries or younger siblings' clothing. Her financial life, like so much of her life, was not her own. And then November came. On November 22, 1963, high school principals across the country turned on their PA systems and announced that President Kennedy had been shot in Dallas. Classrooms broke apart. Teachers wept in front of their students. Teenagers walked home in silence through autumn streets, not quite understanding what kind of world they were walking into now. It is difficult to overstate what Kennedy had meant to this generation. He was young, and he was theirs in a way no previous president had been. He and Jackie were glamorous and alive in a way that reached through the television screen. His assassination was not just political news. It was the moment the collective childhood of the baby boom generation ended in a single afternoon. The girl who had been listening to her transistor radio under the pillow just weeks earlier, the one waiting for the phone to ring, practicing dance moves in the living room, sleeping in orange juice can curlers, folding notes into triangles, that girl walked out of November 1963 older than she had walked in. Something had cracked open. She didn't know yet what would come through it. Within 4 years, the world she had grown up inside would be nearly unrecognizable. The Beatles arrived. The Vietnam War escalated, and American boys her age started coming home in flag-draped boxes. The counterculture exploded. Women began to demand, loudly and collectively, the things they had been quietly denied for generations. The rigid, immaculate world of 1963, the press skirts, the phone on the wall, the girdle, the silence at the dinner table, began to come apart at the seams. But here is the thing that's easy to lose in the sweep of all that change. She was not simply a victim of her era. She was a full human being living in it, finding genuine joy in a cherry Coke shared with a best friend, in a perfect song on the radio, in a carefully folded note passed across a hallway, in the specific, irreplaceable pleasure of a transistor radio, playing something beautiful at midnight when the house was dark and still. The modern tendency is to look back at 1963 and feel only pity or only nostalgia, both of which are too simple. The girls who lived that year were navigating a world that asked a great deal of them and gave them very little in return, legally, professionally, reproductively, financially. And they did it with remarkable grace and more quiet resilience than they were ever given credit for. What we owe them is not pity, not a romanticized postcard version of their lives either. What we owe them is the truth, that it was genuinely harder than it looked, that the smile in the yearbook photo was real, and so was everything it was covering, that the girl in the shared bedroom in the dark with the radio pressed to her ear was reaching for something, freedom, self, future, beauty, with the only small tools she had been given. She didn't know that in just a few years, the world would begin to change. She only knew the song playing softly under the pillow and the way it made the night feel, just briefly, entirely her own.